A ruthless vampire king, whose heart had grown colder than blood over centuries, finally feels humanity for the first time when he meets an innocent human girl. Her love forces him to choose between his curse, his power, and his eternal life, leading him to make one last painful yet beautiful sacrifice. You know how every town has that one story everyone is afraid to tell after dark. In this valley, that story has a name: the Vampire King. On most nights, his castle looked like a shadow carved out of the sky. The towers rose above the forest like broken teeth, black against a silver moon, while cold mist wrapped itself around the stones as if the mountain were trying to hide him. Inside, torches burned low and steady, but there was little movement, little sound. The hallways were wide, the ceilings high, yet the silence was so deep it felt like the whole castle was holding its breath. At the highest balcony, the Vampire King stood alone, a pale figure against the night. His name, long forgotten by the world, was Kael. To the villagers, he was a monster, a curse, a dark legend parents used to frighten their children into obedience. But up on that balcony, with the wind tangling through his silver hair and the moonlight resting on his face, he did not look like a nightmare. He looked like someone who had been tired for a very, very long time. Kael watched the valley below as if he were looking at a memory he could not touch. Tiny orange lights flickered where the village lay, warm and distant, like stars fallen gently to the earth. He listened because his hearing could stretch farther than any human's. He could catch the creak of doors, the soft laughter from a tavern, the murmur of families saying good night. And beneath it all, like a hidden river, he heard the sound he both needed and hated most: the steady, fragile beating of human hearts. Once, centuries ago, he had not minded that sound. Once he had hunted without regret, had ruled with fear and cold pride. He had believed he was beyond weakness, beyond kindness, beyond anything as soft as doubt. But time has a way of wearing down even stone, and guilt presses heavier than any crown. Now every heartbeat he heard felt like a question he could not answer. How many had he silenced? How many lives had ended because of him? He turned away from the balcony and moved through the great hall, his steps light, almost soundless on the old stone floor. Portraits lined the walls, kings, queens, warriors, but the faces were covered with dark cloths. Kael could not bear to look at them anymore. They reminded him of a time when his name had been spoken with hope instead of fear. They reminded him of the man he once tried to be before the night that changed him forever. On a long table near the throne, a crystal goblet waited, filled with dark, thick liquid that caught the torchlight. Kael's jaw tightened. He reached for it with a slow, careful hand as if touching something poisonous. The blood was not taken by force, not anymore. Gold from his hidden vaults found its way into the hands of the desperate and the poor. Quiet bargains were made. He did what he could to cause the least harm. But the truth never changed. His life still depended on what could destroy theirs. He lifted the goblet, held it beneath his nose, and then set it down again untouched. Hunger burned at the edges of his self-control, but another feeling burned even deeper: shame. There had been a time when he fed without thinking. Now every sip tasted like a confession. It reminded him that for all his secret kindness, he was still bound to a darkness he could not escape. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried something new through the open balcony doors, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for a breeze if not for the shape it made in the air. It was a voice, a human voice. Someone was singing in the valley. Kael froze. No one sang at night in this place, not anymore. Not since the legends had grown teeth and shadows. Yet there it was, a clear, trembling melody floating up the mountain, thin but brave, like a candle flame standing against the dark. He stepped back out onto the balcony and closed his eyes, letting the notes roll over him. The song was not perfect. The voice broke on some high notes, and the words were simple, almost childlike: a prayer for safety, a wish for courage, a promise not to run from the truth. But to Kael it sounded like something he had not heard in centuries: hope. The kind of hope that did not pretend there was no fear, but chose to stand anyway. He felt something stir in his chest, a tightness he had not allowed himself to feel. The song wrapped itself around a memory: a girl laughing in sunlight, a hand in his, a life that had ended the night he lost control. He pushed the memory down, as he always did, but the song would not let him sink back into numbness. It reached into the hollow places inside him and refused to let go. Down in the village square, a young woman stood alone beside an old well, a lantern at her feet. Her dress was simple, the color of forest leaves, her hair pulled back from a face that tried very hard not to look afraid. She sang toward the mountain, toward the castle no one dared mention by name. The villagers watched from their windows, curtains half drawn, whispering to each other that she was foolish, reckless, maybe even cursed. But she kept singing, her voice shaking, her hands clenched into fists to stop them from trembling. Kael leaned on the stone railing, listening to every word. She was not challenging him with anger or hatred. She was not begging him to spare her either. She was asking a question wrapped inside the song. If there is even a little goodness left in you, do you remember how to hear it? Something inside him almost answered out loud. He did not know this girl, and yet there was a strange, painful familiarity in the way she refused to bow to fear. Long ago, he had been like that, standing between danger and his people, swearing to protect them. Now he was the danger they hid from. The mountain wind carried the final line of her song up to him, clear and unbroken. If you are listening, I won't run from the truth of you. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not as a legend, not as a curse, as if he was still a person. In that moment, the castle felt smaller around him, like a cage instead of a fortress. His power, his immortality, his fearsome name, none of it felt like strength. Strength was down there in the square, in a girl whose knees were shaking but who kept her voice steady for the sake of others hiding in the dark. Kael's hands curled around the stone edge of the balcony. He had rules, ancient, careful rules that kept the villagers alive and kept his hunger under control. He did not go down to the village. He did not speak to them. He did not answer when they whispered about him. Distance was the only kindness he trusted himself to give. But the song had opened a door inside him that would not close. He could hear the girl's heartbeat now, quick but steady. He could hear the frightened breaths of those watching her from behind closed shutters. He could feel their fear of him, thick as smoke in the air. And buried deep within that fear, he could feel something else. The untouched, faint belief that maybe, just maybe, the stories were not complete. A single thought rose in him, quiet but unstoppable. If I stay hidden, I will always be the monster they believe I am. He stepped back from the balcony, shadows clinging to his form like a cloak. For a long moment he stood in the center of the hall, caught between 2 centuries of habit and a single fragile song. Then, with a slow exhale he did not actually need to take, he made a choice he had not made in hundreds of years. Tonight, he would break his own rule. The torches flickered as if startled when he passed. The castle doors opened without a sound, and the cold night rushed in, mixing with the strange warmth still echoing from the song. Kael stepped out onto the mountain path, the forest bending away from him, leaves trembling as he moved through the dark. Down in the square, the girl was finishing her last note, her voice raw but proud. She bent to pick up her lantern, unaware that the forest shadows behind her had begun to gather in a strange, deliberate way. The villagers watching from their windows felt something shift in the air, though they could not have said what. Their legends had never prepared them for this. As Kael reached the edge of the trees, the lantern light touched the tips of his fingers, pale as moonlight, where they rested against the bark of an old oak. He could see her clearly now. He could see the fear in her eyes and the stubborn courage shining right beside it. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back before it was too late, before his presence changed her life forever. But he took one more step toward the light. For the first time in centuries, the Vampire King stood only a few breaths away from a human who was not screaming or running, a human who had called out to the hidden goodness in him. His voice rose in his throat, a word forming that he had not spoken aloud to anyone in longer than he could remember. Before he could say it, the girl stilled, sensing him, and slowly turned toward the darkness where he stood. And in that single, fragile heartbeat, half a step between shadow and moonlight, Kael realized that whatever happened next would either break the last piece of him that believed in redemption or save it. Her eyes found him before her mind could decide whether to be afraid. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that single, fragile line between lantern light and shadow, where a tall, pale figure stood half hidden by the trees, the moon painting silver along the sharp edges of his face. The night sounds faded, the chirp of insects, the rustle of leaves, and all she could hear was the quiet rush of her own breathing and the strange, steady stillness that clung to him like a second skin. Kael felt the familiar burn rise in his throat, the old, bitter hunger that always woke when a human came too close. It threaded through his veins, whispering of easy power, of how simple it would be to step forward, to take what his body still believed it needed. But beneath that cold instinct, another feeling pressed harder, the shock of being seen. Not as a rumor, not as a shadow moving behind distant windows, but as a man standing a few steps away from a girl whose courage did not quite hide her fear. "You're real," she breathed, the words barely more than air between them. Her voice trembled, but she did not back away. The lantern at her feet sent warm light up across her face, softening the stubborn line of her jaw and catching in her dark, wide eyes. She looked younger like this, more breakable than her song had sounded, yet there was something unshakable in her gaze. She was afraid, yes, but she was also refusing to run. "You should not be here," Kael said quietly. His voice, unused for so long, came out lower and rougher than he intended, like a door that had not been opened in years. A flicker of surprise crossed her face at the sound of it, at the simple fact that the monster from their stories could speak like any man. She swallowed, lifted her chin a little, and answered with more steadiness than before. "I know that's why no one else came," she said. "They chose me." The words struck him harder than any weapon. For a moment, the forest felt colder, the stars sharper, as if the whole night were listening. Kale stepped no closer, but his attention tightened around her like a shield. "I chose you," he repeated. "For what?" She let out a breath that tried to be a laugh and failed halfway. "For the sacrifice," she said simply. "The elder said someone had to go to the square tonight, to remind you that we remember the old bargain, to keep you from coming to our doors instead." Her eyes searched his face as if trying to read the truth between his stillness and the stories she had grown up with. "They thought I would be the least missed." Something inside Cale flinched, a deep, quiet recoil that did not show on his face but burned at his core. He had not asked for this. Centuries ago he had fed openly, cruelly, believing himself above guilt, but he had stopped long before any elder in that village had been born. He had retreated into shadow and silence, thinking that if he took nothing they would be safe. And yet in their fear they had kept the ritual alive, sacrificing not to his demand but to their own terror. "What is your name?" he asked, before the anger at himself and at the old stories could twist into something darker. The girl blinked as if the question itself was unexpected. "Elena," she said after a moment. "My name is Elena." "Elena," he repeated, tasting the sound with strange care. It was a simple name, but in his mouth it felt like a fragile promise, something living and human in a voice that had spoken mostly to empty walls. "There is no bargain," he said. "Not anymore. I have not taken from your people in a very long time." She studied him, her brow furrowing. "Then why are we still afraid of you?" she whispered. "Why did my grandmother teach me to never look at the mountain after dark? Why are our children told to stay inside when the moon is full?" "Because I earned your fear," Kale said. The words tasted like ash, but he did not look away. "Because the things I did do not vanish just because I wish they had never happened." His hands, hidden by the sleeves of his dark coat, curled slightly. "Fear has a longer life than a man's memory, Elena, longer even than mine." They stood like that for a moment, the distance between them filled with everything unsaid. A cold wind slid down from the upper cliffs, tugging at her hair, pushing his coat back from his frame. The lantern flame shivered but did not go out. Somewhere nearby, a wolf howled, low and uncertain, and another answered deeper in the forest. Elena's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to him. "I sang because I wanted to know if there was anything else in you besides their fear," she said. "If you were only a monster or something more complicated than that." "You walked out alone at night," he replied, for a question. "For an answer," she corrected softly. "If I didn't come, they would keep waiting for you in their heads. They would keep hating a shadow. I thought, if I looked you in the face, maybe I would know whether to be afraid or to tell them the stories are wrong." A dry branch snapped somewhere behind her, closer this time. Kale's attention snapped to the darkness at the edge of the square. Eyes glowed faintly between the trunks, several pairs low to the ground, moving slowly. The wolves were circling, drawn by the smell of living fear and the strange, heavy stillness that hung around their ancient king. Elena didn't see them yet. Her gaze was locked on him, waiting for an answer that could untangle years of whispered warnings. Kale felt the pull of two instincts, old and new, tearing in opposite directions. One told him to disappear, to leave before his presence made things worse. The other, quieter but stronger now, told him that walking away would mean letting her courage be punished by teeth that were not his. The decision took less than a heartbeat. "Do not move," he said, his voice losing its roughness, suddenly calm and clear. Before she could ask why, he stepped fully from the shadow of the tree. For the first time in centuries, Kael let himself be lit by more than moonlight. The lantern glow touched his features, running along the sharp planes of his cheeks, the slight curve of lips that had forgotten how to smile, the pale, ancient eyes that held too many winters. Elena's breath hitched, not quite a gasp, not quite a cry, but she did not stumble back. She simply stared. "You're not what I imagined," she murmured. "You look." "Hungry," he supplied, a bitter half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Sad," she said instead. The word struck him harder than any accusation. Before he could answer, a low growl rolled across the stones behind her. Elena finally turned, following his earlier glance, and her body went rigid. 3 wolves had stepped into the edge of the lantern's circle, lean and ragged, their eyes bright with wild hunger. Winter had been cruel in the forest. They were desperate enough to approach the village. Elena instinctively moved back and in doing so stepped closer to Kael. Every nerve in him reacted at once, the scent of her, the rush of her heartbeat, the thin, wild thread of her fear. His fangs ached, but he held perfectly still, fingers digging into his own palms until he felt the faint sting of his own blood, dark and slow. The wolves tensed, ready to leap. Kael lifted one hand, palm outward, and spoke a single word in a language older than the village, older even than the castle. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that pressed against the night. The wolves skidded to a halt as if struck by an invisible wall. For a moment they stared at him, their ears flattening, their bodies shrinking low. Then, with soft, whining growls, they backed away into the trees and disappeared, their hunger still unsatisfied, but their instincts warning them away from something even more dangerous. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You saved me," she whispered, turning back to him, eyes wide in the half-light. "But you're supposed to be the danger." "Perhaps I am," Kael said quietly, "but not to you, not tonight." She studied him, searching again for the trap, the cruel trick, the hidden cost. Instead, she saw a tired man standing very still, as if every movement had to be carefully chosen. "If you don't want sacrifices," she said, "and you don't want to hurt us, then why do you stay up there alone? Why not leave this place and start again somewhere no one knows your name?" He let his gaze drift for a moment toward the dark outline of the castle on the mountain. "Because running does not erase what I am," he said, "and because I am not sure I deserve a new beginning when so many never got one because of me." His eyes returned to her, and there was something raw in them now, a vulnerability he had hidden even from himself. "This valley reminds me of what I did. It keeps me honest." Elena's hand lifted, stopped in the air between them, then very slowly, she closed the remaining distance and rested her fingers lightly on the back of his icy hand. He flinched, less from fear than from shock at the simple, human warmth of the touch. No one had touched him without terror in so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. "You're still here," she said softly. "You didn't run when you heard my song. That has to mean something." The contact shattered another layer of his careful distance. A memory rose, another hand in his, warm and laughing, a promise made under a summer sky that had ended in blood and screaming, and a silence that lasted for centuries. The echo of it crashed against the present, against Elena's steady, gentle grip. For a heartbeat, he felt the old fear, that anyone he let close would die because of him. He pulled his hand back more quickly than he meant to. "You should go home," he said. "Tell them their sacrifice returned alive. Tell them the bargain is over. Tell them I will not come to their doors." He hesitated, then added, "Not ever again if I can help it." Her brow drew together. "Will you stay up there then, alone, while we sleep in fear of a monster that doesn't exist anymore?" "The monster existed," he said. "He wore my face." She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of distant voices cut across the square. Men's voices, sharp and anxious, carrying the tremor of fear, trying to sound like courage. Torches flared at the edge of the narrow street leading to the well, their light bouncing off stone walls, growing nearer step by careful step. "They're coming to see if I'm dead," Elena said softly, realization dawning in her eyes. "If you're satisfied." Kael heard more than she did. The rasp of metal as someone gripped an old rusted blade, the jangle of charms meant to ward off evil, the uneven breathing of men who did not truly believe their own bravery. He also heard their children, awake behind shuttered windows, holding each other and listening for screams. You should not be seen with me," he said. "They will be afraid of you too." Elena shook her head, her jaw setting. "If they only ever see you in their nightmares, they'll never stop hating you," she replied. Maybe it has to start somewhere." She glanced toward the approaching torches, then back at him. Her eyes were shining now, not just with fear, but with something like stubborn hope. "Maybe it can start tonight." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Shadows of men with torches stretched long across the stones, reaching toward them. Kael could disappear in an instant, vanish back into the trees, leave Elena to invent any story she wished. That would be the safest choice for her, for the fragile control he had built around his hunger, for the quiet, hidden life he had carved out of guilt. But her hand found his again, fingers curling with surprising strength around his cold skin. "Please," she whispered, "don't make me lie about you." He looked down at their joined hands, at the warmth of her trust burning against the chill of his curse. Something in his chest ached so sharply it almost felt like a heartbeat. The torches were almost upon them now. The men's shapes were clear in the darkness, faces tight with dread and determination. Kael lifted his gaze, made his choice, and did the one thing he had always sworn never to do again. He stepped forward, out of the deep shadow and into the full circle of torchlight, Elena still at his side. Gasps tore through the men at the edge of the square. One torch slipped, almost fell before a shaking hand caught it. Someone whispered a prayer under his breath. Someone else muttered, "The king," as if the word itself might draw blood. For a long, hanging moment, no one moved. The firelight painted Kael's pale skin in flickering gold and red, set cold sparks in his eyes, picked out the faint, almost invisible lines of old grief around his mouth. He did not bare his teeth. He did not lift his hands. He only stood there, tall and terribly still, letting them see him. And as the villagers stared at the monster from their stories, Elena took a small breath, loosened her grip just enough to stand a little more in front of him, and said, voice shaking but clear, "Oh, he saved me." The words fell into the stunned silence like a stone into deep water, their ripples just beginning to spread as, for the first time in centuries, the Vampire King waited, not to be feared, not to be obeyed, but to be judged. The torches shook in their hands, but the fear burning in the villagers' eyes was sharp and clear. You could almost feel the moment tearing itself in two, one side made of stories and hatred, the other made of a girl's trembling voice saying, "He saved me." The oldest man stepped forward, his back bent but his gaze hard. His name was Don Mateo, the village elder, and his hands had buried more friends than anyone else there. He looked at Elena, then at Kael, then back again, as if he could not decide which of them was more dangerous. "Elena," he said, his voice rough, "step away from him." She swallowed but didn't move. Her fingers were still wrapped around Kael's cold hand, the only thing keeping his ancient stillness tied to this small, bright circle of human life. She could feel the way he held himself back, like a storm trapped behind glass. "He saved me from the wolves," she said. "You saw them at the edge of the forest these past weeks. Starving, desperate, they would have torn me apart." "He called them," one of the younger men shouted, fear leaking into anger. "It's his power. He needed us afraid to make his trick work." Kael could have silenced the man with one glance, one step, one tiny, terrible use of his strength. Instead, he stood perfectly still. The torches painted harsh shadows across his face, but his eyes were steady, almost gentle. "If I had wanted blood tonight," he said quietly, "none of you would be standing here." The men flinched at the calm in his words. It was not a threat. It was simply the truth laid bare like a blade on a table. Someone muttered a prayer. Another man tightened his grip on the rusted sword he carried, the metal shaking. Don Mateo narrowed his eyes. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "Why show yourself now after all these years of hiding? Why walk into our square with one of our girls at your side?" Kael looked at Elena for a brief moment, and a softer light moved behind his gaze. "Because she sang," he answered. And because I have grown tired of being a nightmare that no longer feeds, a curse that no longer strikes and still steals your sleep each night. The elder stared at him as if seeing something he could not fit into his old stories. You expect us to believe you are what changed? He asked. Monsters don't change, they only learn new tricks. A silence fell heavy and thick. Kael could have argued. He could have listed the years he had starved himself thin, the gold he had quietly slipped into the village when winters were cruel, the unseen ways he had bent the shadows to keep worse things from their doors. But he felt how little those things would mean, thrown against the mountain of their fear. I do not expect your belief, he said instead, or your kindness. Only this, if you choose to hate me for what I truly am, not for a story twisted in the dark. Elena stepped forward half a pace, forcing herself between Kael and the blades pointed his way. He could have killed me, she said. He didn't, he saved me. He turned away from blood when it was right in front of him. Can any of you say you would have turned away from what you needed most when you were starving? Her words hit deeper than she knew. Some of the men shifted, shame flickering across their faces as they remembered days they had taken more than they should, food, money, harsh words, just to survive. The torches crackled softly, sparks spinning into the night. Don Mateo's jaw tightened. He was not ready to let go, not yet. Fine, he said. If he is so changed, let him prove it. He lifted his chin, eyes never leaving Kael's face. If you truly regret what you are, monster, then give us justice. Kneel, let us end you and end our fear with you. The words hung in the cold air, sharp and final. A murmur ran through the group, some shocked, some relieved. One of the men took a half step closer, hope and terror fighting in his eyes. Elena's breath caught. Stop, she whispered, looking up at Kael. Her fingers tightened on his hand. You don't have to. But Kael was already moving. He did not run, he did not strike. Slowly, with the grace of someone laying down a crown that had grown too heavy, he released Elena's hand and walked to the center of the square. The stones there were worn smooth by years of market days, of children's games, of lovers' meetings. Now they waited under his feet. He went down on one knee. Gasps broke from a dozen throats. The Vampire King, the terror of their mountains, the shadow in their lullabies, knelt in front of them like a penitent soldier. He bowed his head, silver hair falling forward to hide his eyes. If my death will give your children peace, he said softly, if it will heal even one of the scars I gave this valley long ago, then take it. I will not fight you. Every instinct inside him screamed. The hunger raged at being offered up so simply. The old, bitter pride hissed that a king doesn't kneel to those he once ruled. But something else, something he had found in the fragile thread of Elena's song, held firm: humility. A tired, quiet acceptance that perhaps his life was not his to cling to anymore. For a long moment, no one moved. The man with the sword stepped forward, his face pale, sweat shining at his temple. His hands shook so badly the blade rattled. He had dreamed of this moment, maybe, in those long, frightened nights, the monster at his mercy, the village finally safe. Now it was here, and he looked more like a frightened boy than a hero. He lifted the sword. Elena cried out, running toward Kael. Wait, she shouted. You're about to kill the only thing between us and what lives in that forest. As if her words had called them, a sound rose from the trees, an answering howl deeper and more savage than before. But this time it wasn't just a few hungry wolves. It was many, dozens. The air seemed to vibrate with their voices, a wild, ugly chorus wrapped in hunger and winter and old, feral fear. The men froze, eyes snapping toward the tree line. Between the torches and the moonlight, they could see glowing shapes moving in the dark, weaving between the trunks. The earlier pack had been a warning, a testing edge. This was the full storm. Kael lifted his head, still kneeling, his eyes narrowing. He felt it before they saw it, not just wolves, but something else, something older and more vicious, drawn by his presence. Legends had a way of waking things that should have stayed sleeping. The first of the wolves broke from the trees, lips drawn back, ribs visible under its fur. Then another, and another. A line of predators formed at the edge of the square, held back only by the fire and a thin line of trembling men who knew, deep down, that old swords and shaking hands were not enough. They smell our fear, one man whispered. No, Kael said, quietly rising to his feet. They smell mine. For a second, no one understood, but it was true. The same dark power that allowed him to command the wild things could also draw them. In his years of isolation, he had held it in tight circles around the castle. Tonight, by stepping down into the village, by letting his own restraint crack open, he had called the forest to their doors. I did this, he said, more to himself than to them. I brought them here. He turned to Don Mateo, to Elena, to the ring of villagers pressed close behind their makeshift weapons. I cannot change what I am, he said, but I can choose what I do with it. He stepped past Elena, past the line of men, until only a few paces separated him from the wolves. Their eyes glowed, their bodies tensed, their breath smoked in the cold air. Behind them, deeper in the trees, something larger moved, a shadow among shadows. Elena's heart pounded. Kael. Stay back, he said softly without turning. Please. There was no command in the word, only a quiet request and a strange, fragile trust that she would honor it. He lifted both hands, palms outward, and spoke again in that ancient language, the one that had sent the first wolves away. But this time the word he used was different. It did not push them back. It called them closer to him and only to him. The wolves surged forward as one. Torches flew up, men shouted, children screamed from behind shuttered windows. But the wolves did not break for the crowd. Something stronger than hunger bent their path. They rushed straight toward Kael, claws scraping stone, jaws open, eyes fixed on his unmoving figure. At the last second, he closed his eyes. The first wolf leapt and then stopped in midair as if caught by invisible chains. The second slammed into something that wasn't there and tumbled back. A third tried to circle around, only to yelp and shrink away, tail tucking under. A circle formed around Kael, a ring of writhing shadows and snarling bodies pushed low by an unseen force. His jaw clenched, his fists curling as he pulled the wildness into himself, took the fear, the hunger, the rage, and bound it with his own. Pain flickered across his features, the cost of holding so much fury inside a form already cursed. You see, Don Mateo breathed, half horrified. He commands them. No, Elena whispered, tears standing in her eyes as she watched him tremble. He's carrying them. It was costing him, anyone could see that. His shoulders shook, his breath came sharp and shallow as if the invisible weight was pressing on his chest. Veins darkened at his temples, his eyes burning brighter, too bright, as if the monster inside him was waking and clawing at the bars he had set. He could end it easily, turn those wolves loose on the men behind him, release the gathered violence in a single terrible wave. The power was right there, begging. But he held the line, for them, for the valley, for the girl who had sung to the pieces of him that still believed in goodness. Go, he whispered, voice breaking on the word. The wolves whined, confused. He pushed harder. Go hunt in the high passes, far from this place, leave them. Another word in the old tongue followed, one that tasted like fire and winter and command. The invisible ring snapped open. The wolves staggered back, turning in tight panic circles as if disoriented. Then one by one they bolted, not toward the houses, not toward the open doors and scattered children, but back into the forest, up toward the cold, empty cliffs where only rock and wind waited. Within seconds they were gone, their howls fading into the distance. Kael swayed, suddenly unmoored without the resistance of their rage to push against. The power he'd used, the power he'd refused to twist into cruelty, crashed through him like a broken wave. His knees buckled. Elena ran to him, catching his shoulders as he sank to the stones. Up close, she could see the fine cracks of strain in his control, a tremor at the corner of his mouth, the tight set of his jaw as he forced his fangs to stay hidden. He had held back a storm, and it had nearly torn him apart from the inside. Kael, she whispered, her voice shaking. He managed a faint, tired smile. Still alive, he said, a good sign. Around them, the villagers slowly lowered their weapons. The torches dipped. Ash floated in the air like tired snow. Where they had expected blood and death, there was only a man on his knees, breathing hard, a young woman's arms the only thing keeping him from falling. Don Mateo stepped forward, but this time the anger in his eyes had softened into something heavier. Confusion, sorrow, a grudging respect that scared him more than hatred ever had. "You saved us," he said. The words were small, but in his mouth they were enormous. Kael didn't look up. "I endangered you first," he replied. "This is only balance." "Balance," Elena repeated softly. She looked at the elder, at the people she had grown up with, their faces lined with fear and long habit. "How many years have we carried this fear?" she asked. "How many nights have we told our children that the thing up on that mountain wants to kill us, while he was up there trying not to?" Silence again, but this one was different, less sharp, more thinking. A little boy slipped from behind his mother's skirt. His dark eyes were round, his fists rubbing at them in the way of a child who had been woken from sleep by shouting. He looked at Kael, then at Elena, then at the forest. "You made the wolves go away," he said, voice high and clear. His mother hissed his name and reached for him, but Kael only watched the boy with a strange, aching tenderness. "Oh, yes," he said, "I made them go away." The boy frowned as if working through a puzzle, then gave a tiny, serious nod. "Then you can stay," he said simply. "Monsters don't make wolves go away, they bring them." It was such a child's logic, but somehow it slipped past every wall, every shield. You could see it happen, shoulders lowered, breaths eased. The sword in the young man's hand finally fell to his side, its tip scraping harmlessly on the stone. Don Mateo looked from the boy to the kneeling vampire, to Elena holding him up as if he were something precious instead of something cursed. His face crumpled for a moment with old grief, grief for those lost in years past, for friends and family who had vanished into the dark when Kael had been a very different kind of king. "I cannot forget," he said, voice rough. "Not what happened, not what you did." Kael nodded once. "I would not ask you to." "But I can see," the elder went on slowly, "that killing you here now would not be justice, it would be revenge, and revenge feeds the darkness, not the light." He drew in a steadying breath. "So listen, Vampire King, you will not be our god, our judge, or our nightmare anymore. If you stay as something else." Kael lifted his gaze just enough to meet the old man's eyes. "As what?" he asked quietly. "Our guardian," Elena said before anyone else could speak. Her hand was still on his shoulder, steady and sure. "Not above us, not below us, just beside us, watching the forest so we can finally sleep." The word hung between all of them, guardians. It tasted strange, new, dangerous in a different way because it carried trust inside it. But it also carried a chance, the first real one Kael had been given in centuries, to choose again and again not who he had been but who he would be now. Don Mateo hesitated, then gave a single, slow nod. "If you break this trust," he said, "we will fight you with everything we have, but if you keep it—" His gaze shifted to Elena, then to the tiny faces peeking from behind doorways and shutters. "Maybe the next generation will remember you differently than we did." Kael bowed his head not as a king now, but as a man who understood the weight of what he was receiving. "I will not ask for your forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve that yet, but I will accept your terms. I will stand between you and the dark as long as I can." Elena helped him to his feet. He leaned on her more than he wanted to, but her grip was steady, her presence a warm, living anchor in a world that had always felt cold to him. As the villagers slowly dispersed, some still watching him with wary eyes, others whispering in low, shocked voices, the square emptied, leaving only the two of them by the old well and the fading lantern light. "You chose them over yourself," Elena said softly once they were alone. "You always do, don't you?" He let out a quiet breath that might almost have been a laugh. "Not always," he said, "but I am trying." He looked down at her, really looked, the way he had not allowed himself before. "Elena, you risked everything tonight for a monster you had never met." "I risked it for a man I heard in your silence," she answered. "For the way you listened to my song. For the way you looked at our village from that cold mountain like you were mourning something you could never touch." He swallowed. "You should be afraid of me," he said, though the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "I am," she admitted, "a little." Then she lifted a shoulder. "But I'm more afraid of what we become if we refuse to see the good in anyone who's ever done wrong." The moon had slipped lower in the sky, making the castle look less like a threat and more like a lonely silhouette against the stars. Kael followed her gaze to it. "You don't have to go back there alone," she said. "It is where I belong," he replied, "a king in his ruins." "You're not their king anymore," she said gently. "You heard Don Mateo, you're their guardian now. Guardians don't watch from a distance and do nothing, they learn names, they listen. They come down from the mountain once in a while." The idea felt both terrifying and strangely beautiful. For centuries, he had believed that distance was his only kindness. Now, for the first time, he wondered if closeness, careful, chosen, humble, could be another kind. He looked at her, at the courage in her eyes, at the warmth in her hand still wrapped around his. Something deep inside him shifted, like ice cracking to let water move beneath for the first time in years. "You would come," he asked quietly, "to the castle to visit a monster in his broken house." She smiled, soft and steady. "I would come to visit a man who's trying to be better," she said. "And if you keep trying, Kael, one day maybe even you will believe that's who you are." Well, time passed. The story of that night did not vanish. Stories never do, but it changed. Children still whispered about the Vampire King, but now they argued at bedtime over whether he was more frightening or more brave. The old tale of the monster who demanded sacrifices faded, replaced by a quieter one about a pale guardian who watched the forest line and sent the worst things back into the dark. Lanterns began to appear at the edge of the fields, small, simple lights left on stones and fence posts, not as offerings of fear but as thanks. Sometimes there were little bundles beside them, bread, herbs, a written note in a child's unsteady hand. Kael never took the food, but he read every note. He kept them in a wooden box in the castle, each one a small weight on the other side of the scale from his past. And Elena, she kept her promise. She climbed the mountain path often, at first with excuses, herbs that grew only in the high cliffs, questions about strange animal tracks, concerns about storms. Later, she came with fewer reasons and more silence. They would stand on the balcony together, looking down at the valley, talking softly about small things and great ones. The way the seasons shifted, the way grief settled, the way hope refused to die even in the hardest winters. He told her piece by piece about his past, about the night he was turned, about the woman he had loved and lost to his first wild hunger. He expected her to pull away, to look at him with the disgust he knew he deserved. But she only listened, eyes bright with quiet tears, and placed her hand over his where it gripped the stone railing. "You cannot undo what happened," she told him once when his voice finally broke. "But you can honor her by who you choose to be now. Every life you protect, every child who grows up without fearing the dark, that is a kind of apology she can feel wherever she is." Slowly, Kael began to believe that his curse did not have to define his soul. He learned the rhythms of the village, whose roof leaked in heavy rain, which widow's back ached too much to chop wood, which children wandered too close to the forest chasing dragonflies. He moved in the shadows not as a hunter, but as a quiet helper, a fixed roof here, a stack of wood there, a child gently turned back toward home by a sudden, inexplicable gust of wind. They saw only traces of him, but they knew. And as the years turned, the fear in their stories thinned. Respect, caution, even a strange kind of affection replaced it. They did not pretend he was harmless. They did not forget the past, but they allowed something new to live beside it. One night, standing on the balcony under a wide, calm sky, Elena leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. Below them, the village flickered with warm light, laughter drifting faintly through the air. Above, 1,000 stars burned, distant and clear. "Oh, you hear that?" she asked. He listened, not to heartbeats this time, not to the rush of blood, but to the sound that had become more precious to him than any of those. Laughter, unafraid, ordinary, beautiful human laughter. "Oh yes," he said, "I hear it." "That's you too," she whispered. "You did that, you helped make that sound possible." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth of her words settle in the space where shame had always lived. It did not erase the past, it did not change what he had been, but it stood beside it, solid and real and bright. When he opened his eyes, Elena was watching him. In her gaze there was no fear now, only trust, only a warmth that reached deeper than any he had ever known. "How did you do it?" he asked softly. "How did you teach a monster to believe he could be more?" She shook her head with a small smile. "I didn't," she said. "You were never only a monster. You were always a man carrying too much darkness alone. I just refused to run away from your light." Something in him broke open then, not with pain, but with a rush of feeling so strong it almost hurt anyway. For centuries, love had been a memory tied to loss, to death, to the worst part of his curse. Now, standing here with her hand in his, it felt like something else, a bridge between what he had been and what he could still become. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers gently with hers. "If I have found any redemption," he said, voice low and steady, "it is because you sang to the part of me that still wanted it, even when I had given up. You gave me a mirror that showed not only my sins, but my choices." She squeezed his hand. "Then keep choosing," she replied. "That's all any of us can do." On the horizon, the first pale hint of dawn touched the edge of the world, painting the sky in soft gray and blue. Kael stepped back into the shadow of the archway where the sun could not reach him, but he did not turn away from it as he once had. He watched the growing light with a quiet, aching joy. He could never stand in that light, it would always burn him, but he could protect the people who lived beneath it. He could love even from the shadows, and for the first time since his curse began, that felt like enough. Beside him, Elena stayed, her presence a gentle, constant warmth at his side. In her eyes, in the village below, in the laughter he had helped make possible, Kael had finally found something the legends never spoke of. Not just fear, not just power, but redemption found not through blood or terror or endless penance, but through a single, stubborn human love that refused to believe he was beyond saving. And from that night on, when the wind moved through the valley and the moon sat high over the dark line of the forest, people said the shadows on the mountain looked different. Less like a monster watching, more like a guardian standing beside the woman who had taught him how to be human again.